Good morning, everyone. Let's start our Sunday class with some Gita Dhyanam verses first. Om Pathaye Pratibodhitam Bhagavata Narayan Swayam Vyasena Grathitam Puranamamina Madhye Mahabharatam Advaitam Ritvarshinim Bhagavatim Ashtadashadhyayane Amtvam Anusandhame Bhagavad Gita Bhaktivishane नमोस्तुते व्यास विशाल बुद्धे फुल अरविंद आयत पत्र नेत्र येन तव्या भारत तैल पूर्णा प्रज्वलितो ज्ञान में प्रदीपः प्रपान पारी जाताये तोत्र वेत्र एक पाने ज्ञान मुद्राये कृष्णाये गीता अमृत दुहे नमः सर्वोपनिषदो गावो दोगदा गोपाल नंदना पार्थो वत्सा सुधीर भोक्ता दुग्धम गीता अमृतम महत् वसुदेव सुतम देवम कंस चानूरमर्दनम देवकी परमानंदम कृष्णम वंदे जगत्कुरम भीष्म द्रोण तथा जयद्रथ जला गांधार नीलोत्पला शल्य ग्रावती कृपेन वाहनी कर्णेन वेलाकुला अश्वत्थाम विकर्ण घोर मकरा दुर्योधन अवर्तने सो तीर्णा खलु पांडवै रन नदी कवर्तका केशवा पाराशर्य वत्सरोजमलम गीता अर्थकंधोटकम नानाख्यानक केसरम हरि कथा संबोधन अबोधितम लोके सज्जन शक पदय रह पे मानम मुदा भूयाद भारत पंकजम कलिमल प्रध्वंसी न श्रेयसे मूकम करोति वाचालम पंगुम लंघ्यते गिरिम यत्कृपातमहं वंदे परमानंद माधवम यम ब्रह्म वरुण इंद्र रुद्र मरुतः स्तुन्वन्ति दिव्ये सवे वेदे सांग पद क्रमोपनिषदे गायन्ति यम सामगा ध्यान अवस्थे तद्गतेन मनसा पश्यन्ति यम योगिनो यस्यन्तं न विदुसुर असुर गना देवाय तस्मै नमः. Okay, let's open our books on chapter 13, Kshetra Kshetrajna Vibhaga Yog. And we ended our last week's class with verse number 27. And that's where Lord Krishna is saying that he sees, who sees the Supreme Lord existing equally in all beings. The unperishing within the perishing. So the material things, they perish. The divine part does not perish. And he says that person is truly seeing, who sees that existing equally in all being. Okay, so nobody bigger or smaller, everybody the same. So now let's start the class with verse number 28. Samam pashyan hi sarvatra sam avasthitam ishwaram na hinasti atmanaha atmanam tata yati pramagatim. Samam, equally. Pashyan, seeing. He means indeed sarvatra, everywhere. Sam avasthitam, equally dwelling. Ishwaram, the Lord. Na means not, hinastihi, destroys. Atmana, by the self. Atmanam, the self. Tataha means then. Yati means goes. Pram, the highest. Gatim, the goal. Indeed, he who sees the same Lord everywhere, equally dwelling, destroys not the self by the self. Therefore, he goes to the highest goal. So it's not only in the beings alone, he says everywhere. So this is in connection with the last verse where he is saying in all beings. See, he said, who sees the Supreme Lord existing equally in all beings. So not only in the beings, in between the beings too, everywhere. There is nowhere where God is not. So that's what he's trying to clarify for us. To discover the spiritual reality in and through this change and sorrow is to end all our agitations. So that's why he says this kind of a person reaches the highest goal. Highest goal where there's no suffering, no sorrow, and no fear. See, our mind is made out of Maya, which is called material energy. Mind is pleasure seeking by nature. And being a product of this Maya, is spontaneously inclined to material pleasures. That's why Lord Krishna keeps on telling us, keep the mind in check with the help of the intellect. See, all this knowledge which is giving us, it should go into our intellect, into the buddhi. The intellect needs to be empowered with the true knowledge. Those who learn to see God as the Supreme Soul present in all beings, they begin to live by this knowledge. Naturally, outcome of that knowledge is they will refrain from mistreating, cheating, or insulting others, because they perceive the presence of God in them. They maintain a very healthy attitude of respect and service towards others. And that's how they elevate their mind, by seeing God in all beings. And finally, outcome of that is they see God everywhere. When they see God everywhere, they reach the Supreme. Nobody is inferior. Nobody is lower. Everybody is same. So when he says he destroys not the self by the self, we saw in chapter 6 also, verses 5 and 6, Lord Krishna explained when exactly the self becomes the enemy of the self. It is whenever the lower egocentric individuality is not available for sure guidance. That means for the higher principle of wisdom in ourselves, the lower becomes our enemy. It's almost like when a car we are sitting in, it is not under our control. It is no use to us. In fact, it can destroy us too. So the same way, when the lower in us is not available for the guidance of the higher, if the senses are not listening to the mind, and the mind is not listening to the intellect, and intellect does not keep an eye on the reality, the Atma, then the former turns out to be an enemy of the latter. That's what he's trying to warn us. Have the lower under the guidance of the higher. Senses should listen to the mind, mind should listen to the intellect, intellect should always remember who the owner is, who the real is. That's why that example of chariot with the horses as the senses and the rein as the mind and the charioteer as the intellect. We should keep it in mind. And if you do this and live a life like this, Lord Krishna says he goes to the highest goal, the supreme goal. And that is the same for all of us. Because this agyan, this non-apprehension creates a veil, and we don't recognize the eternal divinity in us, which is everywhere. And the consequence of that is sensuality, materialistic pursuits, selfish satisfactions. They just become the only worthwhile pursuits of our life. We think this life is given just for those. The state of an individual gains when both these non-apprehension and the misapprehension are ended. Only then we can experience this absolute experience, absolute bliss. And this is what goes to the highest means. Let's look at verse number 29. Prakritya ev cha karmani kriye manani sarvashah ya pashyati tatha atmanam arkartaram sapashyati. Prakritya, by prakriti. Ev means alone, cha means and, karmani, actions. Kriye manani, being performed. Sarvasha, all. Ya means who, pashyati, sees. Tatha means also. Atmanam, the self. Akartaram, actionless. So means he, pashyati, sees. He sees, who sees that all actions are performed by Prakriti alone. And that the self is actionless. Okay. So very clearly he is telling us, the self means the soul or the Atma, the spirit doesn't do anything. Who really does it? The material nature of ours, which is the body, the mind, the intellect, the ego. Soul doesn't do anything. But in the presence of the soul, this material energy can function. If the soul is not there to energize it, they won't function. They are inert without it. But the action is done by them. Okay? It's almost like just as the president is responsible for the decision of the country to go to war, although he does not fight. Similarly, the soul is responsible for the actions of a living entity, even though they are performed by the body, mind, and intellect. That's why a spiritual seeker must keep both sides in mind. We should not ignore the Prakriti part, and we should definitely not ignore who we really are. Rishi Vashishta instructed Lord Ram. He said, Karta Bahir Karta Antar Loke Vivayar Raghav. So we are responsible for our inner world and we are responsible for our outer world, and we got to learn how to create a bridge between these two. Okay, but we should remember who is really doing it. It's almost like the electricity is one, and yet the light manifested in the bulbs are different from equipment to equipment because of the very quality of the equipment. So whichever example brings clarity for us, we should always remember. But Prakriti alone performs all actions. So very clearly told by Lord Krishna and in our Upanishads also. This is the Vedic philosophy. Matter is the equipment that orders the types of action that should manifest. If the mind is bad, the life expressed through it will also be bad. So that means if the mind is Rajasic or Tamasic, outcome will be Tamasic or Rajasic. If the mind is Sattvic, the outcome will be Sattvic. So equipment. So all actions are according to the types of desires entertained by the intellect. So intellect decides. So in the presence of the soul, the Prakriti function, the Atma functioning in the field called the knower of the field. Okay, the Purush. This is what he has been telling us because this was the question of Arjuna, and acts in the world outside. When the knower of the field leaves the field, there is no more any activity in the field, nor is there any activity for the self itself. So the self is actionless, not acting. He who is capable of recognizing all this is the real knower. He sees who sees. So the manifestations of the individuals are different from person to person because of the differences in the composition and makeup of the upadhis. These layers of our personality are called upadhis. So that's why our actions look different. So when they are destroyed, all differences merge to express the one infinite experience, the Supreme Lord. Verse number 30. Yada bhut prithak bhavam ek stham anupashyati tataha eva cha vistaram brahm sampadhyate tada. Yada means when bhut prithak bhavam, the whole variety of beings, ek stham resting in one, anupashyati sees. Tataha, from that, ev means alone, cha means and, vistaram, the spread. Brahm sampadhyate. Brahm is that absolute truth. Sampadhyate, he becomes. Tada means then. When he sees, so that means the seeker, when he sees the whole variety of beings as resting in the one. So that means part of that one. And spreading forth from that one alone, he then becomes Brahma. So when we really recognize this unity in this diversity, only then we are seeing. So to know that the self is the ultimate truth behind the names and forms, because name and forms can be many, but essence is only one. Okay? When we know only the names and the forms, that's just a partial knowledge. When we know the essence is the same in all the names and forms, that is the true knowledge. That is like a complete understanding of life. And it can arise only when we see at once and understand also how from the self, the endless names and forms rise up. And they spread everywhere. When we look up there, the stars and the moon, during the daytime, the sun, and all kinds of forms, they all are part of that same one. In our own body, we can see our arms, our legs, the hair on our head, our ears, our eyes, they're all part of this one unit. The same way outside also. It's all part of the same reality. A person with the right understanding can recognize all this. The separate existence of all beings in the one. And this is what, with the grace of Lord Krishna, Arjuna saw that. In that one, he saw everything. In that chapter 11. And once having understood the ocean, see, if we are just standing near the ocean and we are looking at all the waves and the bubbles, the froth, the water, we know it's all part of the ocean. There's only one ocean and it's all part of it. That is the right understanding. The same thing over here in this beautiful world. So the self alone can recognize the self. He who is recognizing the one homogeneous self and who is experiencing that the consciousness in him is one with the homogeneousness, consciousness everywhere, is a truly understanding. Truly understanding. That's it. It's called a true wisdom or the right perception. Okay, that's why Lord Krishna says, he sees who sees. Because there are numerous forms of life in existence. We all know there's the tiniest amoeba to the most powerful celestial gods also. But all of them are rooted in the same reality, which is called the soul, and which is part of the God, seated in the body, which is made from the material energy. So these are like a very fundamentals we should always remember if we want to study these deep scriptures. The distinctions between the forms are not due to the soul. Remember that. It's not a human form has a better soul than an ant body and the ant soul. Soul is the same. Different bodies manifested by the material energy. Upon birth, the bodies of all living beings are created from the material energy, which is called Maya. And at death, what happens? It goes back to that Maya, the material energy. That's why that common saying, from dust to dust, came from those elemental forces, those 5 elements, and goes back to that. When we see the variety of living beings all rooted in the same material nature, the unity behind the diversity is realized. We see the same spiritual substratum, and that will lead to Brahma realization. That's why it's very important. Otherwise, we just keep on differentiating ourselves, even as human beings, based upon the gender, based upon the culture, based upon the race. We just keep on dividing ourselves. And more we divide, more suffering, more sorrow. So this unity, that's what Lord Krishna is mentioning over here. This is the real knowledge. Because Arjuna asked what the knowledge is. This is the knowledge. Next verse, 31. Anaditvat nirguntvat paramatma ayam avyah sharirastha api kauntya na karoti na lipyate. Anaditvat, being without beginning. Nirguntvat, being devoid of qualities. And qualities over here means sattvic, rajasic, tamasic, those qualities. Paramatma, the Supreme Self. Ayam means this, avya, imperishable. Sharirastha, dwelling in this body. Api means even. Kaunteya, son of Kunti, that's Arjuna. Na karoti, na means not karoti, acts, na lipyate, not is tainted. Being without a beginning and being devoid of qualities, the Supreme Self, the imperishable, though dwelling in the body, O Arjuna, neither acts nor is tainted. That means there's no blemish on it. There's no impressions on the Atma, and it doesn't act either. So the spirit identifying itself with the field Prakriti becomes the knower of the field Purush. It is this individualized ego that acts and accomplishes. Okay, so the ego. So over here in this verse, we have been given some logical reasons why the infinite consciousness, though dwelling in the body, neither acts nor is blemished, tainted. It's almost like when a judge gives the order to hang a murderer, no taint on him. He's just doing his job. Okay? He has not committed any sin. So that's how this soul is over here. So God situated within the heart of living beings as the supreme soul never identifies with the body, nor is affected by its states of existence. So this soul's presence in the material body does not make him material. So the soul doesn't become material. And nor this soul is subject to the law of karma and the cycle of birth and death. They are experienced by the ego center. Having no beginning, that means no beginning means no cause. So it's a causeless. Truth being that from which everything comes is the uncaused cause for all that has been created. See, only the material energy goes through the changes. Atma never goes through any change because it doesn't have any quality. There's no gun attached to it. Anything which has those guns, if something is tamasic, can be changed to rajasic or sattvic or vice versa. Atma doesn't have any guns, so there can never be any change. And that's why it's imperishable also. That which is, because if something cannot be changed, it cannot perish. So it's not changeable, it's not perishable either. So it's called imperishable. Okay, so that which is changeable can perish, and that which has no quality cannot change. So that's the reason it is said beginningless, qualityless, imperishable, supreme self. Though living in the physical structure, thrilling or giving, energizing this matter field does not itself and by itself act. Okay, so if somebody says, where is this all written? It's right here in Bhagavad Gita. Very clearly, again and again, Lord Krishna, this is the style of Lord Krishna. These very important logical, factual statements are repeated several times. Next verse. Yatha sarvagatam sokshmayat akasham na uplipyate sarvatra avasthita dehe tatha atma na uplipyate. Yatha means as sarvagatam, all pervading, sokshmayat, because of its subtlety, sukshamta. So subtle. Akasham, ether. Na means not, uplipyate is tainted. Sarvatra, everywhere. Avasthita, seated. Dehe, in the body. Tatha means also. Atma, the self. Na means not. Uplipyate is tainted. As the all-pervading space, ether, is not tainted because of its subtlety. So too the self, seated everywhere in the body, is not tainted. No blemish on it. So he is giving us an analogy over here. Even though the Atma is, see, Akash, the space, is part of the material energy, but it is subtler than the other four. The other four are what? The air, the fire, the water, and the earth. So those four cannot taint the space element. So Akash means actually that which gives accommodation to things. So in the Akash, the others are there. Most pervasive, the subtlest. But Atma is not even part of the nature, but it's only an analogy. He says that Atma, how can Atma be tainted? Subtler thing cannot be conditioned by a grosser factor. Okay, so this is a fact. Nothing that it contains can contaminate it. It pervades all. Nothing pervades it. See, we experience the sleep, the waking, the tiredness, or refreshment, etc., due to the ego that makes it identify with the body. It holds everything, but yet remains unaffected. Atma does not get tired. Atma doesn't sleep. If there's no sleep, there's no wakefulness in the Atma. It is. It holds everything, but yet remains unaffected because it is subtler than the gross objects it holds. It retains its divinity even while it identifies with the material body. Yatha prakashyati ekah kritsnam lokam imam ravi kshetram kshetri tatha kritsnam prakashyati bharat. This is verse number 33. Just as the one sun, yatha means as, prakashyati illumines, ekah one, kritsnam whole, like a complete, lokam world, imam this, ravi means sun, kshetram the field, kshetri the lord of the field, tatha means also, kritsnam the whole, prakashyati illumines, bharat is Arjun. Just as the one sun illumines the whole world, so also the Lord of the field illumines the whole field, O Arjun. Here we see the most striking example in our scriptural literature given to us by Lord Krishna himself. Sun, we see sun up there, it illumines completely. From far, it illumines us at all the times. So the consciousness is illumining the whole body of ourselves. Light itself is the nature of the sun. And in its presence, everything gets illumined. The same way the Atma, the nature of the Atma is awareness. And its presence, everything becomes known, illumined. In the world outside, we see only one sun. It illumines everything, good, bad, vicious, virtuous, ugly, beautiful. No matter what kind of actions are being done, they are being done in that light. The same thing happens inside us also, our inner life. Whether it's a perfect actions we do, joyous actions we do, or ugly actions we do, the Atma never gets contaminated by the wrongdoings, by the perversion of the intellect, or by the crimes of the physical body. So that sun out there does not get tarnished if somebody robs in its light. The same way, Atma does not get tarnished. Okay? So the soul, although seated in the heart, spreads its consciousness throughout the field of the body. And it's ever pure, and it just gives the illumination. Whether we are thinking with our mind, or whether we are deciding with our intellect, or whether we are doing any physical activity with our body, Atma just energizes it. The last verse of this chapter, Kshetra Kshetrajna evam antaram jnana chakshusha bhut prakriti moksham cha ye vidu yanti te paramam. Kshetra Kshetrajna, between the field and the knower of the field. Eva means thus. Antaram, the difference or distinction. Jnana chakshusha, by the eye of wisdom. Bhut, prakriti moksham, the liberation from the prakriti of the beings. Okay, bhut means living entity. Cha means and, ye means so, vidhi no, yanti go. Te means they, param, the supreme. They who, with their eye of wisdom, Gyan Chakshu, come to know the distinction between the field and the knower of the field. Okay, Kshetra and Kshetrajna, knowing these two distinctly, and of the liberation from the prakriti of the being, go to the Supreme. So what do we have to recognize? What do we have to do? And what will we gain? All is given in this last verse over here. So over here, Lord Krishna directly advocates that our life is fulfilled only when we have this very subtle discrimination. When we successfully meditate upon and realize the constitution, that means that what we are made up of, what the essence is and what else we have, our behavior and relationship among the field and the knower of the field and the Supreme Self. All of this. So this is a customary style of Lord Krishna. That's how he winds up the topic of the chapter. So topic of the field and the knower of the field, the summary of all what he said. And he says the true knowledge is to know the distinction between these two. Those possessing such discriminative knowledge, the Gyan Chakshu, do not look upon themselves as the material body. They will identify with their Atma, the spiritual entity. The soul, which is nothing other than the tiny part of God. And they seek the path of spiritual elevation and release from material nature, which is the supreme goal. Because they know that need to tread on this path of enlightenment. They are the true seekers and true wise people. So Gyan Chakshu, got to remember that. We got to light up this knowledge inside us. So the faculty that comes to experience this divine, the divinity everywhere. Sometimes we call it intuition, but it's called Gyan Chakshu, knowing it in reality. So it can be done with a well-integrated instrument. That means a combination of a fully developed head and heart. So we got to use our knowledge also. We got to use our emotions also. Only then we can apprehend this invisible, imperishable one. Okay, so that's why he said that knowing it distinctly, what is field and what is the knower of the field. Otherwise, we just stay confused. That's why non-apprehension of reality gives rise to misapprehension of it. Okay, we got to know it clearly. So this chapter, they say, is the most brilliant chapter in our, not just only in Gita, but other scriptures also. Because this really gives us a direct subjective method of meditating upon and realizing the imperishable and the eternal in ourselves. Because ultimately we have to wake up from this illusion. Or we got to wake up from our dream. If you are having a nightmare, only way to end the nightmare is to wake up. So over here also in this life, we got to wake up, got to get to know this, the truth. We got to rediscover our pure awareness and realize that it is the self is the essence, and that self is the same, not just other beings, he said, everywhere, homogeneous. There's no place where self is not. So we'll end today's class right over here. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vishishyate. Om Shanti 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 Om. Thank you very much.